In the middle of a record-breaking heat wave back in August, Twitter was tearing Taylor Swift to shreds. She wasn't in the news because of a song she wrote or some dress she wore. No, she was getting dragged because of her private jet emissions.
Taylor Swift has been rated the biggest celebrity CO2 polluter of the year so far.
The sustainability research group Yard had just released a report on the celebrities with the largest flight-related carbon footprint, and Taylor Swift topped the charts at number 1. Whether loaning the jet out or using it herself, Swift's private plane made 170 trips in just 7 months, pouring an estimated 8,293 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere. Needless to say, those who cared about climate action were not happy. This was yet another example of the world's richest people disproportionately driving climate change. But as I sat there scrolling through tweet after tweet shaming Taylor Swift for her huge carbon footprint, I couldn't help but feel like something was a little off. And so I began to do some research. This is what I found. This is the story of inequality and how the rich really drive climate change. Why we shouldn't actually care that much about Taylor Swift's personal carbon footprint, why this guy is far worse, and how this might show us a better way to think about carbon inequality. The current narrative around inequality and climate change looks a lot like the findings of an Oxfam report on household income and emissions. The report found that the richest 1% emit double that of the poorest 50%. And newspaper headlines like this and this perpetuate this narrative that the consumption habits of the rich are driving climate change. When we talk about economic inequality and emissions, we too often focus in on the connection between unequal consumption habits leading to unequal emissions. A lens that's only solution is a politics of less. One where decreasing personal consumption, traveling less, and having less is the only way to avoid climate chaos. For the ultra-rich, a contraction of wealth definitely needs to happen. But for the working class who are living paycheck to paycheck, this solution is unappealing and unrealistic. It also conveniently avoids the root cause of the climate crisis. All of this is not to say that looking at inequality is useless. Just the opposite. Inequality is an essential concept for tackling the climate crisis. We just have to move our analysis away from unequal consumption to that of unequal control of production. But thanks to this commercial and the ad campaign that ran throughout the early 2000s alongside it, the carbon footprint has become one of the main vectors through which we view the climate crisis. And the masterminds behind this campaign was none other than BP. This oil giant orchestrated a multi-million-dollar ad blitz in order to popularize the idea of the carbon footprint and place the responsibility for climate change onto the individual consumer. The way we commonly talk about inequality and emissions is no mistake. The fossil fuel industry has spent decades making it seem like our individual consumption habits are causing the climate crisis. A recent analysis of ExxonMobil's internal and external documents found that the company not only downplayed the climate crisis throughout the last 20 years, but also consistently framed it as a consumer demand problem rather than a fossil fuel supply problem, ultimately individualizing responsibility. In part, this is why we're so focused on the damage caused by a rich person's flight log, rather than how they got the money to pay for that private jet in the first place. This needs to change. When we talk about inequality and climate change, we need to zoom out and understand that this is not just a question of who has money and who doesn't and what they do with it, but a question of class. How the unequal ownership of production breeds environmental degradation. In other words, when we talk about inequality in relation to emissions, we need to focus on who controls and profits off of polluting industries. Because for each flight taken or car driven, there is an airline or fuel company and a host of executives gaining profit from our choices. In the words of Matt Huber, author of Climate Change as Class War, if we really want to understand a rich person's contribution to climate change, we shouldn't just look at their consumption. We should ask how they became rich in the first place. And when we start to look at inequality through that lens of who profits off of and who controls what's being produced and how it's being produced, we begin to see that there are just a few rich people actually driving the climate crisis. 11 people dressed in suits walk into a conference room in Switzerland. They sit down and begin to decide the fate of the world. This might sound like an overstatement, but these 11 individuals steered the largest private building materials company in the world, Holcim Limited. This company's main business is cement, a highly polluting good whose 2020 production, as Holcim admits in their annual sustainability report, put 156.3 million metric tons of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. That's almost 19,000 times what Taylor Swift emitted during her flights this year, or 0.45% of all carbon emitted in 2020. 10 members of Holcim's board and its CEO Jan Jenisch control a company that's responsible for 0.45% of all global carbon emissions. This is the inequality that is wrecking our atmosphere and driving the climate crisis. In the words of Matt Huber, what rich people do at home or in their car or in their private jet pales in comparison to the exploitation of labor and the wrecking of the earth that generates the money they enjoy. Unfortunately, the few who own the factories, the mills, the foundries, and wells where fossil fuels and all other materials for our built environments get made are ultimately beholden to profit. So, when we choose commodities, we can only choose those that are profitable to produce in the first place. Under capitalism, the rich few who decide what gets produced will always decide based on what will ultimately generate them profit. Sometimes this means cutting emissions and waste, but most of the time, it does not. Let's go back to Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil, for a moment. He, alongside his fellow capitalists steering the oil industry, have had a disastrous impact on the natural world. One often cited analysis traced 71% of all industrial production emissions to just 100 fossil fuel companies. The boards and owners of these companies, without a doubt, have immense and unequal control over our global emissions and our choice of energy. If they decided to transform their production from one of fossil fuels to that of renewables tomorrow, our global emissions would drop dramatically. But it's not just their own production that they hold sway over. The rich who own the means of production also have the power to sway the political realm. Look no further than the Republican Party of the United States. During the 2020 election year, industrial polluters like Koch Industries and Chevron put $63.2 million directly into the hands of Republicans and spent a total of $139 million influencing elections across the country. So not only do the barons of industry control what is produced, they have immense influence on what policies governments enforce around the world. While capitalists profit off of their destructive production choices, the people selling their labor power to those capitalists to survive, aka the working class, face the brunt of these companies' destruction in the form of wage exploitation and workplace pollution that seeps out into communities and the environment. Unlike the rich who have the luxury of shielding themselves from the worst of the climate change they've caused, the working class often live in communities hit hardest by these crises. They exist in what a working paper from the UN calls a vicious cycle of inequality, wherein initial inequality increases people's exposure to climate hazards like droughts or hurricanes, as well as increases the potential damage that those disasters could cause. And once a disaster has passed, this inequality decreases the ability of those who have been exploited to adequately recover from those disasters, making them even more vulnerable to the next crisis. Essentially, the centuries of dispossession of the working class at the hands of capitalists means they are especially vulnerable to the threats of climate change. But unfortunately, environmental policymakers seem to ignore that climate chaos is rooted in the unequal possession of production concentrated in the hands of the few. In November of 2018, the famous Parisian Champs-Élysées turned into a hellscape. Burning cars set the night aflame as protesters wearing yellow vests clashed against heavily armed riot police. This was the beginning of the Yellow Vest protests that rocked France for months. These protests are a perfect example of why environmental action needs to address class inequality. Sparked by Emmanuel Macron's environmental proposal of raising the gasoline tax, millions of working-class French folk took to the streets. Their reason was quite simple. The fuel tax was yet another proposed policy that disproportionately burdened people who were barely making ends meet. So even though Macron was trying to create action that might reduce emissions, it did so in a way that demanded the working class consume less, while capitalists who own the fossil fuel companies and car production facilities that are actually driving emissions got away relatively unscathed. We will never build power and create change by telling someone who's living paycheck to paycheck to pay more for gas or give up driving to work. What's interesting is that the Yellow Vests are a collection of people across the political spectrum. They reveal that class can be a powerful tool of solidarity. But they also demonstrate that solutions to climate change that focus on individual consumption are unpopular and not effective because they disproportionately hurt the wallets of the working class. The politics of the gas tax and of the carbon footprint are ultimately a politics of less for the masses. In order to truly dismantle the power of the rich, to reverse their environmental impact, we need a politics of more. We need to establish democratic control of the means of production. As Matt Huber writes, class politics is a powerful dot connector. It aims to tie the threads together to make clear that our movements face a common enemy, the capitalist class, and that our struggles seek common goals based on our common humanity, dignity, freedom, and a livable planet. When we begin to frame the climate crisis as the result of not how many flights Taylor Swift goes on, but instead who controls and profits off of what fuel and what planes are being produced, then we can begin to create lasting change. This is exactly what union organizer Tony Mazzocchi found during his years agitating for change in the US. Mazzocchi was one of the first labor leaders in the United States to build strong ties to the environmental movement in the 1960s. He brought scientists to local union meetings who explained the dangers of the chemicals the workers were handling, and asked union members to pressure their bosses and elected officials for change. Mazzocchi shows the success of recognizing that environmental struggles are class struggles and vice versa. He shows that pressuring the capitalist class through strikes, protests, and walkouts at the point of production is a very tangible path towards transforming that production and cutting emissions. While the people who own and profit off of the means of production have outsized power, that power is dwarfed in comparison to the collective power of the workers who actually produce those goods. Maybe the next time you hear someone talk about a celebrity's carbon footprint, you take the time to consider that the people who are profiting off that consumption might be more at fault. But who are the people behind these industries? I've mentioned a couple CEOs throughout this video, but there are certainly more barons of industry making a killing our planet.